Hello, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. This time I am tackling some World War I myths. To be honest, when it comes to history, World War I is one of the most fascinating topics out there. And the more I learn about it, the more fascinated I become with it because its effects still have ripple effects that exist to this very day. Now, obviously, I'm not going to dive into the whole history of World War I. There are plenty of other podcasts out there that do that a hell of a lot better than I could ever do. But in this one, I am going to just mention some little interesting notes, some urban legends, some strange occurrences that happened during this war that has piqued my interest over the years as I have been kind of dabbling into learning about this great conflict. So let's dive into some of those stories today, and as always, we're going to start right at the beginning. So we all know how World War I essentially starts. There's the Serbian separatist group in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Members of this group participate in a conspiracy to assassinate Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. They bungle the initial assassination attempt, but one of the group members then guns down the Archduke as he was in an alley getting his car turned around. And this essentially kicks off World War I through this series of triggered alliances. That's the common myth. That's what everybody pretty much agrees is the spark point of the war. And for the most part, that is true, but what a lot of people don't know is the war could have been avoided if it weren't for the utter incompetence and stupidity of Tsar Nicholas II. And I have talked about Nicholas II before. He was the absolute ruler of Russia at this time. But he was a justifiable idiot. And it's this idiocy that would drive us to the first battle of the war. But let's get some context in here. So, bam, the Archduke is assassinated. And this was largely due to the fact that Serbia wanted to break away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and become its own independent nation. And to be honest, this has been a thing that's been going on in the Balkans forever. Nobody can agree with anybody, and everybody hates each other, and everybody wants to form their own ethnic state. Hell, to some extent, it still happens to this very day. The Balkans have always just been a clusterfuck. Now, naturally, with this Serbian terrorist group assassinating the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Austria-Hungary really clamps down on Serbia. They're occupying it militarily, and they're probably committing atrocities because it is the first half of the 20th century. And they have the backing of Germany, the new upcoming power in the European political sphere. And we have to remember that it wasn't really until the 1880s when Germany became unified and really became an imperial presence in Europe. Up until then, for hundreds of years, it was just this fractured conglomeration of little microstates that nobody really cared about. But in the late 19th century, they unify and they gain a lot of influence. And a lot of this influence is over Austria-Hungary because they're all kind of ethnically German, Hungarian, etc., etc. And to be honest, most of this political unification in Germany is primarily happening under the Prussians because remember what they say about Prussia historically. They weren't a nation, they were an army with land. And of course, throughout the past, I'd say 20, 30 years up until the point of World War I, there hadn't really been any major conflicts in Europe. However, there was this series of alliances going on. So the Germans were allied with Austria-Hungary and loosely allied with the Ottoman Empire. And then like France, England, and Russia had formed a coalition to somewhat oppose them. And it was kind of like early precursors to NATO, so an attack on one is an attack on all. But at this point, I don't know why, I think it's just something to do with humans. This was the point where it was time for war. They were like itching to go to war. So Austria-Hungary is really cracking down militarily on Serbia because Serbia was the place that hosted this terrorist group. And Russia literally was like, hey, don't mess with Serbia. We have an alliance with them. We are going to back them. Get out of Serbia. And at the time, while Russia was industrially and technologically and logistically very backwards compared to the Western world, they did boast an army of 1.4 million. which has kind of always been the Russian way. The Russians don't win wars by being technologically superior or logistically superior. They win wars by just throwing waves upon waves of people at you until you just get tired and give up. And at the time, while ill-equipped with obsolete technology, they did boast the largest standing army in the world, and they had an endless pool of conscripts that they could dip into. So what a lot of people don't understand is, after the assassination of the Archduke, there's all this diplomacy happening all over Europe. And a lot of these powers really don't want to go to war. They want to find some kind of diplomatic internal solution to this Austro-Hungarian Serbian problem. All parties except for our idiot Tsar Nicholas II, he immediately starts to mobilize his army to march against Austria-Hungary. He is adamant. He's like, we're going to war. And at the time, Germany is literally like, dude, why are you mobilizing? If you mobilize, then we have to mobilize, and then everybody else has to mobilize. It's not going to be good. But Nicholas is like, well, fuck you. I'm going to do what I want. I'm Tsar Nicholas II. I'm the ruler of Russia. Send in the troops. And in response to Russia's refusal to demobilize its army, Germany sees no choice but to attack. And German mobilization immediately leads to the Battle of Liege, which would take place on August 4th, 1914. And this was against Belgium, one of the Allied powers, because the Germans had decided to open up the front on France, fearing a French attack. Now, strategically, this is a good idea. They're not attacking Russia directly and invoking that wave of craziness, but they are signaling to the world that the war has started, and they start marching towards France. Belgium gets involved on the side of the Allies because they literally say, hey, we're not a pass-through for you to go invade our neighbors. And the Germans are like, well, you say that, but... And this directly leads to World War I kicking off. It was all due to the incompetence and stupidity of Nicholas II. And I truly believe that if he would have just demobilized his army and had allowed more time for a diplomatic solution to all this, that whole war would have been prevented. Or at the very least, it's extremely scaled down. It could have just been scaled down to Austria and Serbia itself. It's just an interesting little story that I don't think people really know. Of course, when it comes to the Russians, they would be annihilated on the battlefields of Eastern Europe. And this was largely due to the simple fact that logistically, they didn't have the support that they really needed. We gotta remember that even in the early 20th century, Russia was not a modern state. It was a feudal, absolute monarchy. They didn't have a modern economy. They didn't have modern industry. They didn't have the means to wage a modern war. I mean, they did have capitalism, but even at this time, most Russians were peasant farmers. And hell, it was so bad amongst the Russian army that obviously they couldn't arm them all with the Mosin Nagant, which was their primary fighting weapon, which, to be honest, is a hell of a weapon. I actually own a World War II model, but it's basically the same thing, just shorter. But due to rampant ammo shortages on the Eastern Front, the thing was basically a pike, or if you lost your bayonet for some reason, a war club. And most of these men, these conscripts, were marched off to war without weapons. They were told to just get a weapon off of a dead guy. And while World War I did contribute to the fall of Tsarist Russia, it wasn't the only thing that led to the fall of Tsarist Russia. They had been trying to overthrow Tsarist Russia since the 1850s. By they, I mostly mean the Russian people. They wanted democracy or later communism. To them, anything was better than life under the Tsar, especially when they view their Tsar as an absolute moron. But Russia's involvement in this war did directly lead to the Civil War, in which the Red Army won, and it led to the formation of the Soviet Union, which would impact the political sphere of things up until the 1990s when it formally dissolved. And to be honest, those residual effects are still felt today. We still have those old school communist regimes which were influenced by the Soviet Union, who we still have to contend with today. But enough about Russia, let's focus on something else that's interesting from this war. And in this segment, I want to talk about some paranormal encounters that happened during World War I, or alleged paranormal encounters. The most famous being the Angel of Mons. So this little phenomena occurred on the 22nd and 23rd of August in 1914 during the first major engagement of the British Expeditionary Force at the Battle of Mons. So according to this story, as the British Expeditionary Force was retreating from Mons after being outnumbered by the advancing German army, angelic figures, sometimes attributed to as archers, sometimes attributed to as Saint Michael himself for the gleaming sword that he carries, basically the Angel of War, appeared on the skies of the battlefield in between the two lines of soldiers, and this blocked the German advance, and it said that this inspired the British troops to fight with renewed strength, as this all sowed confusion amongst Germans. This event was said to give the soldiers and the civilians at home a sense of divine intervention, that God was on their side and this was a righteous war. And it symbolizes how faith and courage can prevail even in desperate situations such as war. But unfortunately, the story of the Angel of Mons is all bunk. It's all BS. It was actually written as a short story that was published in September 1914 by a Welshman named Arthur Mansion. And readers of the Evening News, where a version of this story was published, had misunderstood the fictional story as an actual eyewitness account. So unfortunately, the Angel of Mons was quickly debunked shortly after the war, but that urban legend still does live on in modern folklore. And that's probably just due to the English themselves. They think that everything they do is divinely justified. But it wasn't the first time we would hear accounts of ghostly figures on the battlefield. Numerous times during World War II, pilots on both sides of the war would see Valkyries. Sometimes these Valkyries would simply lead these pilots out of danger. Sometimes these Valkyries were a little more insidious and would lead them to their deaths. Some men would describe flying their airplanes and they would look out and they would see another plane, and this plane was usually flown by a golden-haired female with blue eyes. They usually had a ghostly or angelic appearance. And in one account, as the Valkyrie flies higher and higher into the sky, once they hit around 20,000 feet, the guy following the Valkyrie, his engine stalls out and he has to come back down because these primitive planes couldn't fly at those altitudes. Now, a lot of accounts of this we get from short stories that were published after the war and misinterpretations of jokes that a lot of German pilots would tell that they had spotted a Valkyrie. And it's just like any urban legend, it gets construed and becomes a thing. But something that wasn't an urban legend that's actually confirmed and verified through historical accounts was the attack of the Dead Men. This attack took place at Oswiec Fortress in northeastern Poland on August 6, 1915. So for context, this was a Russian-held fortress, and the Germans really wanted this fortress, and they were bombarding it all throughout the first part of the war, and they just could not get an advantage. It was said that over 1 million shells were lobbed at this fort. But the Russians would not yield. They would stay and endure. And this was a time during the war when the powers that be were experimenting with chemical weapons, primarily chlorine gas and bromine, but this is also the time of mustard gas. But the gases used in this attack were chlorine and bromine. So on the morning of August 6, 1915, the Germans start to bombard the fort as they always did, but at this time, they had decided to release this gas. So the men down in the trenches or whatever, they would open up the valves and this gas would seep out across the battlefield in this low green cloud. And the Germans were naturally prepared for this. They donned their gas masks and their heavy gloves and their big heavy coats, and all 7,000 of them just sat there waiting to attack this fort, which was now being defended by about 900 Russians. Now, chlorine gas is a very brutal substance. When it comes into contact with moisture, it turns into hydrochloric acid, which is a highly corrosive substance which literally damages the tissues surrounding it, and if inhaled, you will die. It leads to respiratory distress, you bleed from your eyeballs, you can vomit your guts up, and it literally will start to eat your flesh because your flesh is just packed with moisture. So as this pale green gas moved across the battlefield, the effects were immediately apparent. The grass was turning black, and the leaves in the trees had turned yellow and golden due to the moisture in them, and this chemical reaction which created hydrochloric acid. Naturally, any animals or critters in the vicinity were dead, but then it reaches its target and it seeps into the fortress. Now, the thing with this gas is it's easy to spot coming, but as we know, the Russian forces were extremely ill-equipped, and this was another case where that was true, because they didn't have access to gas masks. The best thing they could do was to take rags and put over their faces and hope for the best. So the gas hits these soldiers, and immediately they start coughing up blood and bleeding from the eyes and dying in droves. And the Germans, capitalizing on this, they don all their gas equipment, they cease their heavy barrage, and 7 battalions march toward Osijek Fortress. And they expect to see almost no resistance. However, they were sadly mistaken, because as they crossed this desolate battlefield, they were met with one of the most horrific sights of the war. Somehow, inexplicably, these Russian soldiers who had survived this were fighting on, and they were organizing a bayonet charge. Well over 100 Russians, screaming, bleeding from the eyes, coughing up blood, were rushing at them with bayonets fixed, shambling and charging like absolute zombies out of this fortress, and it takes these Germans by complete surprise, and the Germans instantly retreat because not only is this insane, there's like a psychological aspect to this. You're thinking that these men are dead, but no, all of a sudden there is a shambling horde coming at you, looking like something out of a horror movie. And these Russians at the time, I guarantee you their mindset is, well, if I'm gonna die, I'm gonna take as many Germans with me as possible. So the Germans break ranks and start fleeing, and they flee so fast that they actually get entangled in their own barbed wire. And these Russian soldiers, they take them out one by one, fighting to the bitter end. Miraculously, somehow, a few of these Russian soldiers even survived this battle long enough for them to bury some of their comrades the next day. Essentially, that confident advance by the Germans became a rout, and they were defeated. But ultimately, 2 weeks after this attack, the fort was abandoned by the Russians, not because it ever fell to the Germans, but because the Germans were advancing on other fronts, and they were going to end up encircling them anyway, so they just gave it up. But that really does go down in history as the attack of the dead men. And to be honest, that's really a testament to what some of these men endured during this great war. And that endurance was necessary because we saw some brutal things during this war. Things in warfare that we haven't seen before, and thankfully a lot of those things were outlawed after this war. Of course, air quotes outlawed. We no longer use chemical gas, but we know chemical gas attacks happen in wars. I mean, just look at the ground war in Ukraine right now, or look at Israel right now. I don't want to get political, but we know they're using gas and other, quote, illegal weapons in those wars. But despite all this, there were some hardcore responses to the brutality of this war, and a lot of those responses were largely psychological. World War I is where we get the term the 1,000-yard stare. Now, anybody who's seen Full Metal Jacket knows exactly what that 1,000-yard stare is. You get it when you've been out in the shit too long. But what it really is a psychological response to trauma. It's a way of disassociating that trauma, and it leads to the whole idea of shell shock, which we now know today as PTSD. And And it's true that back then, shell shock was seen as a weakness. It was seen as being a coward. Even in World War II and the Korean Wars, they would see it being called combat fatigue. And even then, it was seen as an act of cowardice. A lot of people were accused of trying to get out of the war by claiming combat fatigue or shell shock. And obviously, this is because we didn't understand the psychological ramifications of PTSD at this time, but it did lead to some wild stuff. And one of the wild things it led to was the infamous wild men of no man's land. And there's many stories about the wild men of no man's land. So we all know what no man's land is. It's that area in between the trenches where you just don't go. It's essentially a killing field. If you go over the top, you're gonna most likely die. You're gonna get mowed down by enemy machine gun fire, or you're gonna get picked off by a sniper or something. But there were tales of men who had just simply been out in the shit too long, who went crazy and wild, and they would disappear into no man's land. And this was on all sides of the war. It was believed that these people were deserters who, having nowhere else to go, took their chances in the killing field, and it was living in this killing field where they went absolutely insane. It was said that they would hunker down in bomb craters and foxholes throughout the day where they couldn't be sighted, or they'd literally just sleep in the mud, laying there as if they were a dead body throughout the day. And it was said at night is when they would become active. They would scramble out of their bomb craters and their mud holes and seek out their dead comrades to feast upon. You could hear screams from these men killing each other as they fought amongst themselves for whatever scraps of remains they could get. And anybody dumb enough to wander into no man's land at night would be a victim of these wild men. It was said that they had completely broken with reality and they were now nothing more than animals, carving out a brutal survival in the closest equivalent to hell we can have on this earth. Of course, some other people state that these men weren't alive at all. They were the ghosts of the fallen soldiers who were still fighting on in the afterlife, and that's why they were active at night. Either way, tales of the wild men flooded the trenches of World War I, and it was believed that these tales were encouraged by the officers in order to keep their men from even thinking about deserting in the middle of the night. Because as the war waned on, a lot of people started to see it in a negative light. They started to see it as a completely pointless war. And when they came back to their homes, the survivors, they would further go on to state that they fought for nothing. Because originally there was this idea that this was going to be a short war, everybody's going to come back a hero, and the political landscape would change somehow. However, after the war, there's kind of this prevailing myth that nothing ever changed, that it was all for nothing. And to be honest, that couldn't be further from the truth, because the ramifications of World War I changed world history as we know it. As I said earlier, we still feel the ripple effects of this war to this very day. For one, this war directly led to the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, while at the same time indirectly leading to the rise of the Soviet Union and weakening the colonial holdings of the British and French empires around the world. We have to remember these were all the political superpowers of their day, and they had all been either weakened or have disappeared. There was a lot of chaos that went on in the wake of this war, as several political entities around the world collapsed. And at this time, the United States, who had come in at the last minute, we weren't a superpower yet. We were kind of a middle power in the world. We had a heavy isolationist policy at the time, so we couldn't be there to mop up the mess. It wouldn't be until after World War II when we would emerge on the stage as a superpower. But where we see a large effect, and this really isn't discussed in a whole lot of these circles, is what happened to the Middle East after World War I. Because after World War I, the European powers start looking at the Middle East, mostly because it's a source of oil, and they start to carve it up for themselves. And in typical European fashion, they do this by just drawing arbitrary lines on a map, without any regards to the populations living in those areas who may hate each other and not want to be lumped together in a single nation. Also, in the wake of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a lot of these entities are warring amongst each other because now they all want to be their own ethnic states. And naturally, the weakened Weimar Republic leads directly to World War II as it is overthrown by the Nazi regime in the 1930s. There were also African colonies that were German colonies like modern-day Namibia, who end up getting swallowed up and administered by places like South Africa. I don't think Namibia actually got its independence until 1992. So World War I did lead to the carving up of the old world to directly lead to this new world that we are in today. Of course, this is all in hindsight. I can see how the generation who went out and fought World War I would interpret it as fighting for nothing, because in their minds, when they came home, nothing had really changed. After the victory parades and the medal ceremonies and all that stuff, the average soldier then just had to move on with his life, and he realized that everything's the same as it was before. I mean, yes, the elite amongst the Allies, they're making off like robber barons because they've carved up the world in this new fashion, and they're going to make billions off of this. But what's in it for me? I'm still poor or working class. I got to go get a job now, probably in a pub or a factory during a time where they're going to start winding down production because we're no longer at peak wartime production, which stimulates economies. It's kind of hard to go from stabbing someone in a trench with a bayonet while up to your knees in mud to sitting in an office all day or being a bank teller. So a lot of these heroes of the war would have felt completely screwed over and disenfranchised after the war. And that's probably why that directly leads to the phrase for this generation. They're called the Lost Generation, because when they marched off to war in 1914, they thought it was going to be 6 weeks. They thought it was going to be easy. They were marching around with like flower wreaths on their heads. And after 4 years of the most brutish, hellish sights on the face of this earth, returning home to see that really nothing in their personal lives had changed, that would make you feel kind of lost. It would make you feel like everything you did was for nothing. And to be honest, I kind of see a shadow of that today with my generation, especially when it came to the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. People forget that those wars were largely fought by the millennial generation, the 18 to 21-year-olds back in 2004. And especially after the case of Afghanistan, when the Taliban had retaken control of the country, there is that general feeling of what was it all for, what was the point? But who knows, maybe 100 years from now, in hindsight, we will know the point. And to be honest, that's really all I have on this topic for today. So as always, this is Mike, this is Urban Legends and Mythology, and if you like what I'm doing, feel free to give it those 5 stars on Spotify, or better yet, download Spotify and follow me on it, because that really helps the channel out more than anything. Or if you're on one of the other platforms, even YouTube, go ahead and follow it there. I think YouTube only has like 30 people listening to it, but hey, if that's the only way to listen to it, then there you go. I will say on YouTube, you don't get all the content though. There are episodes missing due to copyright strikes, so maybe you should download Spotify. Also, go check out the socials. It's just Urban Legends and Mythology at Instagram and Threads. If you want to support the podcast directly, you can just follow the link in the description of every episode. And to be honest, as always, just tell a friend you're listening to a cool little podcast. This is a completely independent podcast. It's literally just me. I'm not part of some big conglomerate like all the other ones out there. So word of mouth is vital in growth when it comes to this show. So once again, this is Mike. I thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next one.